friends, today we are on the threshold of a new series that will be launched today, that is, and it will be called 20th Century Poems and Poets, because we relate, poetry and particular poems with the experiences and the mental condition and the shape of the person who is writing, who is composing. Of course, we understand that poems are somewhat different from and have a kind of autonomy about them, and that they are as much of the writer as of the reader. That's the new interpretation. But we still feel that a part of the sensibility of the poet is definitively expressed through the poem. That apart, the 20th century poems that we discuss in this particular series will be, some kind of an in-depth understanding of the poem and the text of the poem, the words and the phrases, and the time in which the poem is situated, and the problems it reflects, and the stances it takes, and so on and so forth. So we thought that this kind of a series was required because these days, in the early years of the 21st century, and the trend started in the latter half of the 20th century, there is an emphasis on theory in the English courses at the undergraduate level and the postgraduate level, and of course at the level of PhD, the research that we conduct and that we undergo. So then, poems as texts, poems as individual pieces of literature, that gives a different dimension to this particular genre of writing. And keeping these things in mind, we thought that we have a whole series exclusively devoted to the poem. Now, why do I say 20th century? Is because in the 20th century, poetry became, unlike the earlier centuries, the main vehicle of literary expression. The 19th century is known more for its fiction, long and short, and the long fiction, the novel that it started in the 18th century, and before that there is no mention of these things till from the early period to the 18th century. So the 20th century is more or less, substantially devoted to the genre of the poem, the short poem, the poem that has from 15-20 lines to 150 lines if the poem is longer. There are some examples of poems that run into many pages. That apart, in the 20th century has given rise to this trend in a big way, and it requires special consideration and special critical analysis. So keeping these things in mind, and we thought that we'll launch this series. The first speaker in this series is Dr. Richa Bajaj, who teaches English in Hindu College, Delhi University, and she has not only read poems in depth, but also she writes poetry. She has a collection to her credit, and maybe she'll be writing still further to express herself in this genre. So she is an apt starter of this series as a poet, and as one who also considers each poem separately and distinctively. So first, Dr. Richa Bajaj, would you tell us as to what you think of the poem in the 20th century in general, without mincing words?
Yeah, no. What I thought about, as you were talking about the 19th century as the age of the novel, and the revival of poetry in the 20th century, which actually set itself away from convention and normative sort of descriptions. Also, I often think that why is it that in times of crises people turn to poetry? In whether we speak of the world wars in the 20th century, or we speak of our own our own circumstances when we had to go through the pandemic, for instance, a lot of people went back to poetry, and I do think that in the post-pandemic period, there is a kind of a revival of poetry again. I think poetry gets revived during periods of crises. And that is why I also feel that 20th century gives rise to a modern sensibility, and people turn to poetry for meaning, for finding some sanity, but also it embalms the spirit or the soul, so to speak. So in a way, it has that therapeutic quality, and just to make sense of the time, people do turn to poetry, which was the case, I think, during the world wars in the 20th century, and which is why 20th century poem for me is the poem of just a poem that tries to keep people sane or gives them a sense of direction. Just as today I feel that this revival in poetry in the post-pandemic period has made people more sensitive to the genre itself. So I think that is one of the reasons why poetry also revived in the 20th century, and took different forms. But it was again not the poetry, for instance, of the 16th or 17th century, which was majorly aristocratic in nature and which was majorly used by court poets, right? So we've already come a long way away from those poets, and already we've seen this kind of literature being brought to the common people. So I think 20th century poetry also tries to bring poetry out of the clutches of romance and convention, and places it in a very unpoetic way, or in a very unpoetic genre. It tries to bring, for instance, the mundane in poetry. For instance, if you just think of T.S. Eliot, when he wrote The Proof Rock, a lot of people believe that it was far away from poetry. It had nothing, there is no poetry in that poem. That's what a lot of critics said. Again, the idea that what are the standards, what qualifies to be called as a poem, then whether it's to do with its aesthetic quality, that is its form, is it to do with the kind of rhymes and meters or form and style that it uses, that we think of a particular piece as poem. That of course is there. I mean, if you look at, a simple exercise in class that I would take up with students is to tell me how they think something is a poem, and the first answer is, when you look at it, it looks like a poem and it doesn't look like a novel. So of course writers have played with genres, bringing in a kind of a verse novel, or mixing genres, but that is perhaps the way we look at poetry. That is how it looks, which means its form and style, and where the line breaks off and moves to the second line. So I think that is something that so far we have looked at, we've so far seen poetry as a particular set of genre based on its formal principles. But what about poetry in terms of what it does and what it is? Is it to do with the themes? What is it that it brings out that qualifies, that makes it a poem? So I think this is something that is being reinvented in the 20th century. And 20th century poets try to develop a sort of a new aesthetic in poetry, which could bring poetry closer to the mundane life. In fact, the mundane could be expressed, they thought, best through poetry, because that was the place which would be absolutely ill equipped to deal with something mundane, because poetry is supposed to be a romantic, aestheticized thing. To make something most aestheticized, absolutely mundane, serve the purpose of telling people that this is what life is. And when Eliot talks about measuring life in coffee spoons, then he is talking about a regular day in the life of an individual, a middle class man. So I think that is what the early 20th century did for poetry, that is to break it from the shackles of romance and conventional writing, and bring it to bear upon the reality of the time, and to choose a form that was closer to the banal life. Again, it's not to say that they don't make it abstract, or they are not aesthetics. In fact, a lot of early 20th century modernist writers came up with with a very pure aesthetic principle. Also, they believed that form was supreme, and experimentation and craftsmanship was absolutely essential in poetry. So, but where craftsmanship could be appreciated, but the content remained, banal, everyday sort of a thing.
I'm glad you have raised so many points regarding poetry in the 20th century and now in the 21st century. And 2 or 3 things that struck me immediately. One is that the role of crisis in poetry. vis-a-vis poetry. And the second is that crisis is somehow also associated with the World War. So do you think that...
Not just the World War, you see, I think all revolutions, I think 20th century is the century of revolutions, if you just look at it from different points of view. And I'm not just referring to, for instance, Russian Revolution. I'm saying each country that gets decolonized is a revolution in its own country, right? Just the fact that, and beginning, and I mean, we come to the British Empire. I mean, think of Ireland. I wanted to discuss today W.B. Yeats and discuss Ireland in the context, but Ireland was fraught with these kind of civil wars that were taking place during 1919 or so. So from 1919 onwards, it saw itself right in the middle of a civil war, and there was also the War of Independence against the British. So this entire century has seen nations fighting against empires, imperialism, and winning their battles. Almost all countries decolonized, almost all countries won independence for themselves, and winning independence meant revolution. It meant changing a particular social economic order and establishing a new one. So while crisis at one level refers to the world wars, it also refers to the state of change, this kind of a complete revolution, or you could say change or transformation that occurred in society in different countries. So I think that is why poetry became relevant also in these countries where people required a particular lyric to connect with. I mean, think of India in the early 20th century. All the songs, all the lyrics were nationalistic. So poetry comes to the rescue of nationalism, really, when it doesn't know where to find support. So all these instances, I think, play a very important role in building up the 20th century poem.
Well, that's a new point that you are making. Earlier you were talking about the crisis, you are talking about the World War, and then you also brought in very importantly the point of revolutions, social change. And I think when you talk of social change, then you rightly assume also that there is a social participation. There is a participation of the common masses. And that common masses that you say are the subject and the object of poetry in the 20th century, that poems are about common people, it's about common life, common emotions. So there is a kind of a wider connect with social revolutions and with poetry.
Yes.
Are you saying that?
Yes, yes, I'm saying that, and I'm also saying that there is human beings, and this is something which Yeats also, W.B. Yeats, in one of his poems talks about, where he takes a philosophical flight, and he says that we are always looking to we are always driven by hope and pushed back by a sense of despair. So this kind of hope and despair itself is a cycle, and that connects humanity. When I say common people, I actually mean also common human emotions, right? And so poetry taps into those kind of common human emotions, and people are able to connect with one another based on those emotions.
Are you talking like Wordsworth when you say common human emotions? Because he wrote a manifesto called Preface to Lyrical Ballads, where he talked about what poetry should be, and he's talking about what is poetry. So are you deriving your, you're drawing your inspiration from Wordsworthian idea of poetry?
No, actually I'm drawing my inspiration from Yeats. And who was also a sort of a romantic in his own right. He's carrying the tradition of, he's carrying forward the romantic themes, and he was deeply inspired by Keats also, among other poets. So, but what I'm saying here is that Yeats actually talked about the essence of poetry, not just poetry. He talked about the essence of life, and what I'm trying to associate or bring the association here is between poetry and the emotional life of an individual, which gets expressed through poetry. And I mean that, and this is what I want to say, that the emotion of the individual is best captured in the poetic form. So when you are deeply pained, or you're grief stricken, or there is trauma of the world wars, for instance, the first thing that you want to go to is a poem, and maybe a novel, just to engage yourself for for a sustained period of time, but you immediately want a cure, and that's when poetry comes in. So I think that is what I would go with Wordsworth, where he says poetry, for Wordsworth, Wordsworth's poetry is seen as therapeutic for a lot of poets, for instance. So Wordsworth himself saw poetry as a way through which he could come back to his self and rebound. So I think yes, in that sense, it has a Wordsworthian sense, but also very close to Yeats, who believed in this kind of a universal idea, where the self comes to term with the soul, right? And he does that in his poem, A Dialogue of Self and Soul, where the self wants to stay close to life, and he says that the self, a living man, is blind, but but remains connected to the world, right? A living man is blind because he can't see the future, right? But he's content also with the fact that, and he says, I'm content to live it all again. So the idea that in poetry you are always close to life while your soul is being formed, is something I think both the soul and the self play a very important role in poetry itself.
Because we are discussing 20th century poems, and they have a kind of tradition, they have a kind of history regarding them. You have the 17th century poetry in England. We are all scholars of English literature, and in the 17th century poetry is wit. In the 18th century, poetry is thought. Poetry is ideas. Alexander Pope's poetry is an essay in criticism, essay on criticism, whatever. And there he is defining the critical principles in poetry. And then there is a sharp reaction to that kind of poetry, which is criticism of life or whatever, to romanticism, where no ideas, emotions, feelings, recollected or whatever, in tranquility. So that is romanticism. So this background of the 20th century poems and poetry in general, do you think that there is a kind of distinguishing oneself from the immediate past, in the 19th century, or the distant past in the 18th century, or coming into its own as an expression of the 20th century?
No, what I understand from what you're saying is that is 20th century poetry carrying forward the tradition of the previous century,
or distinguishing itself,
or rejecting it and finding its own way out? So I think in many ways both. For instance, in the early 20th century poets such as Yeats, in Yeats you find the influences of the Romantic period also. You find 19th century pre-Raphaelite sort of influences also on Georgian poets, for instance. The early 20th century poets seem to carry this kind of a romantic tradition forward. But the more you move into this century, the closer you get to the world wars is when, and the moment where you also see modernist poetry take shape. I think there is, for instance, in Eliot, a rejection of history and a rejection of the past that seems to impose its pattern on the present, because the present's reality is very different from the past. And I think that is that realization has dawned on the poets at the time, and they believe that the poet is no more the prophet, as for instance Shelley suggested that the poet is. So even though I would say Yeats still believe in the prophetic quality of poetry, I would say from T.S. Eliot onwards, you do not see this tradition of poets as prophets. Poets in fact are victims, more victims than prophets of the situation. Rather than showing the way out to people, the poet is become, because the poet is a sensitive individual, the poet is also not, for instance, immune to the problems around, and is doubly afflicted by the misery around. So I think the sensitive individual is at the center of much of modernist poetry, also existentialist poetry, which makes this kind of a poem a kind of a dealing with the problems of the self, I would say, or the questions of selfhood, or the inability to to rise to the challenge, or to live up to the expectations of the past. So the past has icons, the past has various achievements and feats that it vouches but the present has nothing in store. Again, returning to the world wars, of course, given the situation of the world war, the background of the world war, the individual is in a state of trauma. The individual is also, is in a miserable situation. You see so much of bloodshed and violence and death and amputated bodies around you. Where is hope? So I think the individual is in a way also rendered helpless in this situation where things seem there is a juggernaut which seems to be moving, and the individual has very little role to play. So there are strains of political poetry also in the 20th century. Poetry becomes political, particularly in the post-independence period for, say, countries that get their independence, that is the post-colonial period. So I think post-colonial poetry is very political, and there is a lot of anger and aggression and getting hitting back at the empire in one way or the other, because of the Cold War situation, you have a very politicized environment, and there are already two camps in the world, and one is either a part of one or the other. So whichever camp one becomes a part of, one becomes politically involved in the venture, and then one writes poetry from that perspective and vision. So I think this particular century begins, you can see the fading of romance. You also see the building up of nationalistic poetry. Nationalism and nationalistic poetry is a very strong strain during the 1930s or so, 1920s and 30s, even in Ireland, in India, for instance, and several other countries. This is the period when nationalism is building and nationalistic poetry is taking place. But this is also the period where modernism is taking shape in the West because of as a fallout of the world wars, I think. And this leads to a kind of a poetry of despair and turning to the self, or you could say also individualistic poetry of that period. But soon enough, as you enter the second half of the 20th century, things are, the poetry turns political, I'd say. Poetry also, actually, I don't know to what extent one can call poetry as political, because the moment it turns into an agenda, then, and it turns from nationalism, or was also an agenda at one point in time. The moment it turns patriotic and turns towards propaganda, then it ceases to be poetry in many ways. So I think that question also remains to be answered and to be thought about. Having said that, I think poetry in the second half of the 20th century becomes ideological in nature, if not political, I'd say, because in the sphere of culture, in the sphere of practices that are taken up, whether academic or literary or otherwise, you find that poetry also is being used to project the violence that the poet sees around. For instance, you take the instances of Neruda, of Paz, but also think of the post-colonial poets like you have Walcott and others. So the Canadian poets, right? So all these poets, I think, are speaking from a very specific point of view of their own countries, which makes them take up arms against the erstwhile empires. So therefore I say that it has become more ideological in that period.
You have in the latter part of your discussion dwelt a little, but particularly on the individual, and this kind of understanding of the individual wasn't there in the 19th or 18th centuries. In the 19th century, the idea of the individual emotion came into being, but then all romantic poets belong to the larger tradition of romanticism. In the 20th century, you say that individuals became more particularized. They became more having an identity of their own, and you also use the word helplessness and the suffering and remaining away from, cut off from, and that individual poetry became individualized as a form.
Also anger and frustration and violence. This poetry is marked by violence. think of the beat poets in America. You know, there is so much violence, there is horror. So they are, you know, they are terrified by the kind of violence that resulted from the two world wars. In fact, after the First World War, people believed that this would be the end, and this would be the first war which would also teach people a lesson. But the Second War, you know, happened soon after. So in a way, this century is defined by anger, frustration, and violence also, which the poets then try to project in their works. You know, I'm talking about the beat poets, the angry generations also.
So friends, in this part of the discussion about the series that we are launching today, there has been a certain covering of the issues, and the issues relate to tradition of poetry in the previous centuries, whether this is being carried forward into the 20th century, which is at the center of our discussion. This point has been covered. There are still more that can be tackled in the second half of the discussion, and let's have more views and insights from Dr. Richa Bajaj on those points, which she has touched upon, brought in for consideration for all of us. Thank you.